Hello, Georginaites. Indians? It's probably not the best way to kick off a new podcast on the topic of your beloved hometown and broadcast on the record that you're not 100% sure what people from Georgina are actually called. Now, admittedly, this boy is from Keswick, and I've used the term Keswickian with confidence in the past, but this podcast isn't all about me. My name's Rob MacDonald, by the way, and to be fair, it's not all about Keswick. It's about Georgina. When I think of home, my imagination doesn't start at Ravenshoe and end at... Where does Keswick end exactly? I'm fast losing credibility, so I'm just going to make my point. My community, our community, is Georgina. Yes, I was raised in the heart of Keswick. I'll explain my definition of heart of Keswick later on, but I went to Sutton District High School. I'd go sledding or snowmobiling in Pefferlaw as a kid. I used to bowl in Island Grove, went to Jack and Jill's at Egypt Hall, and got incredibly familiar with our town's backroad arteries that got me to all of these places. My belated apologies to the residents of Bellhaven for all those times I was late for school and took slight liberties with the posted speed limit on my way to first period. My point is, this is my home. This is our home. And this is a podcast about our home. I want to be clear out of the gate, this is not just a podcast for Georgina lifers, those who were here before the Queensway or High Street had traffic lights at their intersections. It's for you, yes, those who have helped shape the character of our town, perhaps through multiple generations. Those who can remember when, quote unquote, and can attach a distant memory to almost any part of our town. But this podcast is as much for the newer members of our community, our new friends and neighbors, those who are just starting their journey and are excited about their newly planted roots and of the prospect of making their own memories in Georgina. And this podcast is for everyone in between, lest I exclude non-residents who simply have a keen interest in our town, perhaps because they used to live or vacation here, or they have family that reside here, or maybe they heard a little bit about our town, for better or worse, and their curiosity is piqued. Regardless of what brought you here, welcome. In the interest of transparency, let me share with you my motivation for creating this podcast. Now, in my work, I've often referenced the British American author and speaker Simon Sinek. He's most famous for the concept of starting with why, that people won't truly buy into an idea until they understand the why behind it. So let me put it in simple terms. I believe in community. Let's remove immediate family from the equation for a moment. In terms of what I derive value from, what makes me happy, what makes me proud, what gives me a sense of satisfaction, and what anchors me and defines my understanding of home, well, it's my community. And my community is Georgina. There's certainly enough anthropological and sociological and perhaps historical evidence to make a case that the human species is tribal in nature. There's also evidence to suggest that simple spatial proximity can be a stronger determining factor in delineating tribes than even the juggernaut of nationalism. I went to school on the West Coast. I was out there for 5 years, and while the overwhelming feeling was one of acceptance and welcomeness, it wasn't long before I became familiar with the term transplant, and that I fell on the wrong side of an us and them dichotomy. As I explored and got to know my surroundings over the 5 years, it became very clear that in terms of many residents' concept of we, they had more in common with their neighbors in Seattle than they did with their fellow Canadians in Toronto, let alone Montreal. And this isn't anecdotal. Google the Cascadia independence movement and you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, don't get me wrong. Sure, I'm Canadian. I spend my time traveling coast to coast every year, and I love this country. There's no precedent in human history for sustaining a national identity across such an immense geographic space. Inevitably, civil war always breaks out. But not here. We're the exception to the rule, and that's something to be proud of. And yes, when I've traveled abroad and encountered Canadians, there's automatically a bond, a partially shared identity. But the same evidence I referenced earlier that suggests we're tribal in nature also suggests that there are limits geographically to this, that there's an indirect relationship between the strength of that bond and sense of community and the size of the space itself. It's logical then that my strongest sense of community is linked to my smallest defined boundary, my town, my hometown. So again, starting with the why, I believe in community. I believe in the bond that we share as citizens of Georgina. I believe that a sense of community can lead to wonderful things, tangible things, yes, but it can also just feel good, Let's be honest, there's enough forces out there that can create division. But subscribing to a community anchored by your hometown is about coming together. It's about inclusion. This podcast is a reminder of the importance of community, and it's my goal to both promote it and make it just a bit easier to sense and to feel. This podcast will address important or just interesting topics in our community. It will introduce influential personalities and organizations and provide a voice to its citizens. I hope to entertain, educate, and most importantly, contribute to your pride of Georgina and your sense of community. Here we go.
I see myself in the water and my footprints in the sand. The moon can push and pull the tide, but this is where I stand.
Now, what gives you the right, you ask? Honestly, there's no vetting process for creating a podcast. It's the beauty of the medium. Having said that, I guess I derive a small sense of entitlement from the simple fact that I see value in the format, and there's currently nothing like this available. I'm a podcast listener. I look for entertainment. I look to learn or simply be informed, and I love podcasts that manage to walk the line and give me all of that. Now, I likely haven't convinced you, and I may not, based solely on background or any kind of merit for that matter, but here's a bit more about me. I moved to Georgina in 1984 at the age of 7. I'll save you the math and tell you I'm 45 years old. My parents loved the water, and so when my dad's work took my family away from Ottawa and the Rideau River to Toronto, they immediately began their hunt for more water. It just so happened my dad also had an affinity for Western exposure, so the search began to narrow. Our new home also needed to be commuting distance to Sony of Canada, located at Steeles and the 404. Now, the 404 terminated at Bloomington back then, but a jaunt along Woodbine was no deal breaker. So, cut to December 1984, I was picking out my room at 314 Lake Drive South in Keswick on the eastern shores of Cooks Bay on Lake Simcoe. Now, of course, that number and street name have both changed since then. We were a stone's throw from Crates Marina, which some of the, we'll call them long-timers, will recall was Dawson's Marina before Crates took it over. Now, since I promised this podcast is not so much about me, let's fast forward through my years at the old Jersey Public School, then through Sutton District High School, and this way we're already up to 1996 if you include OAC, of course. There's plenty of time to unpack items from that time, but we'll let that unfold organically in future episodes. By 1996, I had some decisions to make. I was expected to go to university and study something, and for reasons I don't now remember, I settled on economics at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. I lasted 4 months. At that time, school couldn't compete with my passion, which was car racing. Between the ages of 12 and 16, my summers were mostly spent with the Chiovitis at 3S Go-Karts in Sutton, just down the road from Sybylt's Point. That was home base for my kart racing. When I turned 16, that turned into car racing. By the time I was 19, and at Laurier, supply and demand curves and calculus just seemed like a distraction to what I really wanted to do. So I went and raced cars for a few years. And it confirmed something I was kind of already starting to suspect. Racing is really expensive. When my sponsors decided the bills were more than they could stomach, my racing career came to an unceremonious end. After that, I did what most retired race car drivers do. I was 22, by the way. I taught other people how to race cars, did some stunt driving for the film industry, and generally tried to monetize this skill that I had. But more importantly, appear busy to my parents while living back at their house in Keswick. Now, another thing about me, I need to finish what I start. Books, movies, degrees. Even before my racing career was over, I made the decision to go back to school and spent a year at the University of Ottawa studying theater. Why theater? Because it wasn't economics, but Ottawa was too familiar. I needed something new. I wanted to go as far away as possible, but still be in Canada so I could actually afford school. I applied to the University of Victoria, sight unseen. A few years there, and I ended up with a sociology degree. Now, just before graduation, I said to my advisor, "So what now?" And she said, as though it was obvious, "Oh, you mean with your sociology degree? Well, you have to go to grad school." They don't tell you that when you enroll in sociology. Lesson learned. So on to grad school. I needed another change. I didn't particularly want a master's in sociology. So my advisor suggested I apply to the Master of Public Administration program. It's a natural transition from sociology, and you'll walk into a management position in government, she said. Real job prospects sounded pretty appealing, so 2 more years of school mixed in with co-ops, which included another return to Ottawa, and I'm back in Victoria contemplating my next move. And all I could think about was home. Now, don't get me wrong. I love Victoria. I really do. And maybe it's a second home, but it will always be that. Not a lot of people spend 5 years on Vancouver Island and decide to leave. But I missed my first home, Georgina. I've been gone for 5 years. My mother was ill with advanced multiple sclerosis. My father was getting older. I'd barely seen my sister and hardly knew my niece and nephew. And I missed the lake. I missed the sunsets. I even missed the snow, aspects of it anyway. And so I headed home. I spent the last part of 2007 back at my parents' and actively looking for my first house. And then I found it. An old century home on Church Street in Keswick. A 5-minute drive from my parents, a 5-minute walk to the lake, and distant memories connecting with whatever happened to catch my eye as I drove, rode my bike, or walked around town. In the 15 years that have passed since becoming a homeowner in Georgina, I've gotten married, had children, and grown personally and professionally as I let my roots take hold here again. Incidentally, I never returned to the public sector when I came back to Ontario, building a training and video production company focused on the automotive sector instead. Go figure. Now, to satisfy my desire to be civically engaged and perhaps retain even a trivial connection to my academic background, I briefly entertained a run at town council. In my preliminary research, I hit up my parents' neighbor, Ross Jameson, a longtime Georgina councillor. And in my chat with Ross, it quickly became clear that this was no hobby. It had real responsibilities and demanded significant time. Due to the demands of my schedule, which included lots of travel, I realized, were I fortunate enough to win, I wouldn't be able to provide the level of commitment the position required. So I switched my attention to the board and committee level and found a place with the Public Library Board. Now, this was a great experience, and I really enjoyed doing meaningful work with a talented group of dedicated Georgina citizens. When I was there, again, my schedule constantly interfered with my work on the library board. After one 4-year term, I didn't apply to return. There are only limited spaces on the board, and they deserve to be filled with people who are engaged consistently. I pivoted once again and found a place with the Property Standards Committee for the next term. Now, one of the great things about this committee, again, beyond providing a valuable service alongside passionate community members, is that scheduling is flexible. This made it more likely that I'd be able to make the meetings. I've closed out my second term with this committee, and I'm looking forward to continuing to find ways to do my small part. And just like that, we're in the present. Would you believe that was the Coles Notes version? Now, I won't do that to you again, but context is good, and ultimately, we're unpacking the why, right? Now, I have to say, since becoming a parent, I've become much more aware of the community around me, the institutions, the infrastructure, the support elements. It's also been fun to see how my wife, a transplant from Mount Albert, has embraced Georgina and made it her home. If I didn't have a vested interest in the health and well-being of my community before, well, I certainly do now.
I see myself in the water. I see myself in the water.
Since episode 1 is a bit of an orientation of sorts, it's about time I introduce an important part of the YourTown, Georgina podcast, my friend and colleague, and in this case, producer, Ben Badenoch. Hi, Ben.
Hey, Rob.
Now, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Just born and raised Windsor, Ontario.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's few people say that, but yeah, it's.
I wasn't being sarcastic.
Okay.
I don't know if you were picking up sarcasm.
No, that's okay. I have
sincere.
mixed feelings about the place too. So I don't live there anymore for a reason. So
hey, that walk along the water where you're overlooking Detroit. I mean, it doesn't get much better. Now that's pretty beautiful.
that is true. They do parks well there. They do.
So you tell me you were born and raised in Windsor. So I'm curious, how and when did you become a resident of Georgina?
I became a resident of Georgina about 7 years ago now. My wife is actually from here. Grew up on a farm just outside of Keswick, and we were living in Toronto when we met. Started living there after we got married, and just kind of realized that Toronto was expensive. We were loving it, but there were drawbacks, and the opportunity arose to move up to this area, and we jumped on it.
Yeah, well, I think that journey that you're describing is probably familiar to a lot of people and even listeners of this podcast. And little known fact, we discovered we did a little bit of math early on when we discovered that your wife is born and raised in Georgina as well. That we actually went to elementary school together. In fact, we're both graduates of Jersey Public School.
That is true. I think there was a bit of an age gap there, but yeah, you were there at the same time.
Doing that.
No,
math.
no,
Nobody
we're not getting
cares
that deep.
She was in kindergarten and I was in grade 8, but
your paths crossed in the hallway. That's all that matters.
I'm sure. Now we touched on Windsor just a moment ago there, and I'm sure you have your own pride and hometown pride when it comes to Windsor. But I'm curious to know from your perspective. I mean, having experienced both, and by now for several years, what's the biggest difference between Windsor and Georgina?
There's a few. Georgina, both lakeside cities. A lot of water sports in both. Georgina definitely capitalizes on the water a little more than Windsor does. Windsor, it's kind of forgotten at times. A lot more water access in Georgina, I should say. Definitely a little smaller town feel here. That's what I like. It's very intimate. You get to know a lot of people close by. Also, kind of nice to be an hour from Toronto. So if you want to go see a concert, now admittedly Windsor, you could go to Detroit, but wasn't always as easy with customs and all of that. And but besides that, yeah, there's definitely some similarities. But another thing is it's just not nearly as industrial. Windsor was a very industrial city.
Right.
Place smelt like car paint.
Well, a little bit of car manufacturing going on.
Definitely, yeah. That's the family I grew up in was you can trace back 3 generations working for car companies. So within Windsor, so
we can say it, right? You're a Chrysler man, is that right?
I born and raised again. Yep,
that's all right. I can sense a little bit of pride.
I don't actually own one, but yeah, that's it.
That's okay.
So yeah, those are the big differences.
Yeah,
That's
I think you make a good point. The reality is, in terms of that small town feel, I mean, we're seeing the rapid growth of this town. It's man, they're building houses faster than I can keep track of. But I am happy to say that we've still been able to maintain kind of this small town feel. And the reality is, from my perspective, you can look at that growth in a couple of different ways. Does that mean that we're going to eventually lose that small town feel? It's going to feel bigger, like a town like Windsor. Well, inevitably, I think growth it signifies progress, but we also know that with more residents, it also enriches the cultural fabric of the town. And of course, let's be honest, by the numbers, more tax dollars means more services that we can take advantage of. And we're already starting to see some of the impact of that. So
that is true. I mean, just as I said, in the 7 years I've been here, just seeing how the city has grown and not just how it's grown, but also what it offers now. I mean, the restaurant choices have definitely changed a bit over the years.
Yes.
And a lot more variety now compared to 7 years ago.
You're a bit of a culinary expert, I take it.
I do like my food. I do. I won't lie. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of options, only getting better in that regard. And I'm kind of with you on that point. But beyond the food, let's move past that for a second. Tell us, what's your favorite thing about living in Georgina?
Seeing the stars is a big one. It sounds so small, but as I say, we live just outside of the city. We're very lucky. We walk out there and we can see the stars, and that was something I lost in Toronto. It was you looked up and you just saw the glow of the city. Yeah, that's a big thing. Lack of traffic is very nice. I mean, just the ease of being able to move around the area, and also just all the amenities the area offers. Some great golf courses, as I already pointed out, access to water. There's a lot of great pros living here.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more, and that's certainly the impetus behind this podcast and what has motivated us to put this together. When you talk about views, the stars, there's no question about that. And I've already started talking about my love of the western exposure, the sunsets over the water. But I can tell from firsthand experience, the back roads has something really special to offer from the view perspective, especially when the sun is setting down over the hills. Yeah, you've got a bit of a gem there.
Yeah, we're very lucky. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, you're going to hear a lot more from Ben. I do appreciate the fact that you're supporting the YourTown Georgina podcast. I think Ben's going to bring a unique perspective to the experience. We've got kind of I'll call myself a lifer. I mean, 7 of
that's fair.
40, or I've moved here at 7:45 now. By the math, we can at least qualify at that. I think you were going to use the term transplant for now, but this is your adopted town, and we're glad to have you.
And I don't see myself going anywhere anytime soon. So happy to be here.
That's good.
I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a lady of the lake. I learned to drive on a dirt road, and I got all it takes.
Well, one of my goals with these podcasts is to include guests that can shed light on the Georgina experience and ultimately contribute to that sense of pride that I've been speaking about since the beginning. So, since this is a kickoff of sorts, we're planting roots and building a foundation. My first guest on the YourTown, Georgina podcast is none other than the big man himself, my dad. Sometimes affectionately referred to as Big Mac or Old McD. Most people call him Bob. Now, I never really asked, how do you feel about those monikers Big Mac and Old McD?
Old McD is not one of my favorite, but I guess it's actually a reality.
Well, it's inevitable. You know, I'm going to get there at some point. I'm going to take on the monikers.
There's a few others. There's Black Flag Bob, I guess.
Yeah, well, you know, your racing background isn't something that it didn't make it into the short list of questions that I have for you. I think it's going to come up organically, but for those of you that know anything about motorsport, well, my family's very, very much involved in that, at least in terms of our background. And yeah, if you know what a black flag is, that means you've done something wrong and it's time to come into the pits and talk to the officials. Is that right, Black Flag Bob?
Apparently, I missed 11 of them at Watkins Glen on one lap.
Just 11.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you could be forgiven. And again, we won't dive too deep into that, at least on this podcast, unless by popular request.
I'm sure that'll happen.
Listeners want to know about the racing exploits of Old McD. Sorry, Big Mac. Now, curious though, let's help our listeners out a little bit. And talk about how you came to move your family to Georgina in the first place. How did that happen?
Originally we're from Ottawa, and I have always aspired to have waterfront property, and we lived on the Rideau River in a little town called Manotick, just south of Ottawa. So the company I work for transferred me to Toronto, and of course finding waterfront property in this area was pretty tough. So we lived in Pickering for a couple of years, all the time searching for an appropriate place to settle down finally on waterfront. And after driving from the CN Tower out to about Belleville on Lake Ontario, and then searching out all the smaller places north of Toronto, after the 2 years in Pickering, we decided to move up to Keswick on Lake Simcoe.
So it took you a little while to find it?
Yeah. I mean, even though it was 40 years ago, waterfront property was still at a premium, and not easy to find exactly what we needed.
So, curious, what was it about our house, the house I grew up in, that made you settle, that said this is the one?
There was a couple of things. Number one, I think, was that it was a bungalow, and that was a requirement because of your mom being in the wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, I think, because it was in an isolated part of sort of downtown. While it was on the right lakefront, it was very isolated from any neighbors and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I like my solitudes.
Yeah, you know, it might be a debate for a future podcast. That is, what is downtown Keswick? What's uptown Keswick? I think that could be an episode in and of itself. Now, let me ask you this, Dad, if I can, from your perspective, because you've got, I guess we're approaching about 40 years now in the town of Georgina. How has the town changed since you moved your family here back in 1984?
Oh, it's obviously it's grown tremendously. There was virtually no new suburbs here when we first came here. Simcoe Landing and all that was just
Just fields.
idea. Yeah, it was fields. Yeah.
I remember sitting in my grade 2 class at Jersey Public School when I first learned what a plaza was, and they were going to build this in the farmers' fields just to the west of us. That became what was the IGA back then. But none of those the housing developments behind Jersey, that plaza, none of that existed at that time. So even I can remember. I mean, I can remember this as well. It was a lot more fields back then.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot more open. And frankly, one of the issues about Georgina and Keswick back at that time was it was a relatively tough type of neighborhood.
One thing that we know is that certainly Keswick for a while had a pretty colorful reputation, if I could use that term.
Yeah.
Now, I also recall, though, when we think about when we first moved here, one of the you obviously loved it, and this is why you moved your family here. But one of the, I guess, the cons of living where we lived was the street we lived on was still a dirt road. You used to get very upset that you'd get your Corvette washed and then have to drive it down the dirt road to home.
Well, that not for very long. It was all under construction because '84 was the year they finally put sewers and water,
That's right.
and water in.
That's right.
In that little street. So
That's right. Now, circling back to the lake, because again, you said that it was really the search for waterfront that brought you to this town. What's your best memory of the lake, or can you think of one that comes to mind that's just a good memory that you have of your time on Lake Simcoe?
well, hopefully it's some of the same memories you have. I enjoyed being on the waterfront and having the boat right there at the shoreline. So I mean, it wasn't a big boat; it was a little boat, but we had lots of fun water skiing and taking some short trips up towards Barrie and Snake Island and all that. And yeah, I think the family experiences on the boat. Your mom loved sitting and looking out at the lake. So yeah, these are good memories.
Yeah, and I mean, we'd run out of time if I started going down my own list in terms of the memories of the lake. I've started to touch on that a little bit, but it'll also be a focus of episode 2 on YourTown, Georgina. We'll go a little bit deeper into the impact of the lake, at least from my perspective, but also in terms of its importance to the town. Now, I'm curious in terms of maybe a broader stroke. What does Georgina mean to you when you think about the town? I mean, what does this town mean to you? What Georgina?
It's a pretty tough existential question.
Yeah, I didn't prepare you in any sense. No prep. This is all off the cuff.
Yeah. Well, it's the place I've lived, the place I've brought up my kids, our family, and it's all like you said. It's almost 40 years. I think 39 years now. And it's home.
Yeah.
Georgina is home. There's no question about that.
Yeah. I talked about that a little bit, of course, in my preamble as well, that even going away, and this is spending 5 years in Victoria, spending time in Ottawa as well. Yeah, they say you can't come home, but I don't know if I believe that. Here we are in 2023, and this is where I've decided to stake my roots once again and raise my family. So,
and I'm glad you did.
You're a lucky guy, right? You're a grandpa that has all 4 grandkids and both kids within 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Not everyone's so lucky. So. Now, and it comes in handy, and I'll give you a little bit of props right now, which I would only do because it's more public, but it certainly comes in handy for us as well. A great grandpa. Now, okay, I'm gonna let you off the hook here, Dad. But I'm just curious, and we settled on Keswick. What town came in second? What town was second in the running that we almost end up living in?
It was also Georgina. It was a property in Duclos Point.
Oh,
that we liked. very much, probably even more than the house we settled on. But the extra, I don't know what it is, 20 or 30 kilometers to get up to Duclos.
Right.
Duclos, just was too much of a trek for me. I would add half an hour to my commute.
Right. So it sounds like Georgina was really the only choice. The question was, where in Georgina were we going to settle?
Yeah, and and I wanted Western exposure, so it became pretty obvious where I had to be.
All right. Well, thank you for that, and I appreciate you being here, Dad, and I hope you appreciate having the distinct honor of being the very first guest on the YourTown Georgina podcast.
Got a few other guys that you might want to talk to too.
All right. Well, perhaps a discussion for off the air, but we'll collect the list. There's no shortage of personalities to engage in this context, and that's really the goal with this podcast. So thanks again for being here, Dad, and thank you for joining us on the YourTown Georgina podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you subscribe. That you'll take a moment to learn a little bit more about this town you call home, and to celebrate it, to take pride in it. After all, this is your town, Georgina. To take us out, I'll throw it to a very talented musician, Georgina's own Bernadette Connors, with one of her signature songs appropriately called Georgina. We'll see you next time.
I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a lady of the lake. I learned to drive on a dirt road, and I got all it takes. I see myself in the water, and my footprints in the sand. The moon can push and pull the tide, but this is where I stand. Georgina, I could never really leave ya. I've been all around the world and still you bring me back again. Georgina, I've got friends in the city. They've got a tower and everything. I tried it out for a little while, but where you don't have roots, you can't grow wings. Georgina, I could never really leave ya. I've been all around the world and still you bring me back again. Georgina, when I'm gone I dream ya. Late at night, later on, you're always on my mind. Georgina, should I stay or should I go? I'll always be scared of the great unknown. I see myself in the water, I see myself in the water.